One thing that I also wanted to note related to something you'd said earlier, you could say, and I think you do actually already put it nicely in this book, is that there's existential dilemmas that all human beings at some level will face, right? Like, what does it mean to be with someone in a kind of sexual relation? What is the meaning of procreation? You know, these generational, how do I locate myself? Other existential kind of questions of like, you know, where do we come from? Where do I come from? And presumably mortality. So I just wanted to note that because one of the nice, or I suppose striking examples of that follows your discussion of the elusive communicative nature of a psychotic episode comes in respect of your discussion of Mario. And it just seemed to me pretty clear that the way you describe it, that a lot of people might have found some of his behaviors or some of what he was hearing as a little, you know, out of the ordinary and maybe a little bit disturbing. But when you were able to provide some context for it, it suddenly becomes kind of imminently sensible. It makes a lot of sense. So I don't know if you had other examples of that or if we wanted to move on, but I think some of those things were very significant for me in reading your book.
Yeah, that's of course the key point in the book. That is that what occurs in a psychotic experience, the content in a certain sense matters. The form, the formality of the experience of language and of thoughts changes in psychosis, but what at the level of the content occurs does make sense, and therefore when we are there to listen to it, and because people don't just come to an analyst to talk about only about their psychotic experiences, like the content of hallucinations. Like, for example, you refer to Mario, one of my early patients. He had like the experience. Also, I must say that he had a very low IQ. He had an intellectual disability, but he experienced like a female person that was very close to him and that was like saying things to him, and he was often communicating with her as if he was living in a private world. And then, of course, I listened to him, and he said two things. He told about what she was telling to him, and often it was like sexual content, but in such a way that he thought it was offensive what she was saying to him, and he was reacting to her because what she was saying. But on the other hand, of course, I could see how Mario was interacting, how he was living with his parents, how as a young adult, this was something of like still living as a child in a family, and not like having a position as an adult person in relation to other adult people. And so for me, there was an echo between both. And in Mario's case, I could quite well reconstruct that connection between both, and that's, I guess, always the work that an analyst should try to do. Like, what is being echoed in the psychotic experience? And then, of course, the question will be, and how to work with it, because it's something of the mental work that we need to do with our unconscious. We have to listen with our unconscious to what people say, not just with our ego. We don't listen with our ego in the sense that we try to understand and to get the story. It's like also listening with our unconscious and what it echoes in us when we take into account and the symptomatic experience and what we have heard about what they have been telling about their lives. And there we have to be present in a certain sense, also in psychosis.
So what I'd also like to ask is something about the way you structure the book. Your second chapter is about discrete psychotic experiences, and then you move on to manifest psychosis. So maybe you could say something briefly about that. But then what would also be useful is to speak a little bit about how you define manifest psychotic experiences. And a quote from page 89 is as follows. You say, manifest psychotic experiences are a response to a nascent feeling of alienation.
Yeah.
When it happens, either reality starts to speak for itself in the form of hallucinations, or else reality is invaded by a series of mysterious associations and meanings within the context of a delusion. So if you could say a little bit more both about how you think about hallucinations, how you think about delusions, and how you think about the distinction between discrete psychotic experiences and a manifest psychosis.
Yeah. So maybe let's just return to also a basic idea that I articulated in the book, which is that we actually, as human beings, we put something of a net of signifiers over the real as a basic image. That's what
Mhm.
when we speak, it's not just a signifying chain, like a linear thing, but all the linear speech that we articulate is like associatively connected in webs of signifiers. And so my idea is that in psychosis, something of a whole indeed occurs in the web of the signifier. And then when people go to the points, the very specific issues where something of narrative organization and words itself tend to be absent, then I think discrete psychotic experiences occur where something becomes vague for people, something of the narrative organization goes lost. And narrative organization can go lost both in reality or in myself. And if
Mhm.
something of narrative organization goes lost in myself, automatic things start to happen in me and with me, like I start doing things that are strange, but I don't feel like I'm doing it like intentionally, but there's something of a force that is acting in me that is so powerful that I cannot stop. And the same can happen at the level of your thoughts, of your speech, where something of an automatism occurs, like you having things in your mind that occur like imposed thoughts, um, or you may be losing thoughts and not being able to think anymore. Uh, and that so can happen inside, like with speech, with thoughts, with behavioral impulses, let's say, but also at the level of affective life, where it might feel as if you don't feel anymore, or that you have an anger in you that is so overwhelming, but you don't know where it comes from. Huh? But that's being overwhelmed. And the same can happen in the outside world, where something of like a not understanding anymore what people are doing, not having any connection anymore with ordinary people and ordinary society. So there's something of an estrangement that happens. And often when these discrete psychotic experiences come to the fore, people have an experience of losing agency, like losing this experience of I am the master in my own house or in the house of my own mind, which Freud already said is an illusion, but it's a constructive illusion, meaning that it helps us to believe
Mhm.
in reality. But in psychosis, well, in these discrete psychotic experiences, that tends to go away. And that's very difficult. But you could say that from a Lacanian point of view, it's actually very true when people experience it, because they temporarily tend to lose the illusion of self-control that we tend to believe in. So that's like for me, like the discrete psychotic experience. And what is then happening in hallucinations and delusions? Well, something is intensified of that process, and what is added to it is an experience of intrusion, like like that there is an active intruding element from outside that invades my consciousness, which is not just me observing a change in the world, but the world directing itself actively to me in a different way. And in a hallucination, of course, it's something of a communication, um, like often in a sensory register, like an image or a sound, and often says, well, not only Lacan, also people describe it, it's often in a voice. Huh? It's often a strange communication in a certain sense, like
Mhm.
something that for them has an empirical reality. And then in what is then typical for delusions is that obviously it also starts always a delusion with something of a revelation. And that might be a revelation through hallucination, but often it's also linked to um, a revelation in that is observable to the rest of the world. Like, for example, someone who is driving their car and there are other cars and they start to see like specific colors. Like, it's not a coincidence that right now it's a red car that is next to me, because, and then it starts to be a signal, the red, for something purely in an associative way. And that's like what usually happens in delusions. Like, it's also seen as something is being communicated actively, something is being revealed, and then they enter a world where they try to make sense of that strange communication. um, and often it's like indeed like haunting me, or communicating something very special to me, and maybe I am special because I'm the one who is receiving that communication.
You know what I find very helpful about that? Well, a bunch of things, but one of the description of the real being covered or overlain with a web of signifiers is I think, a really interesting and important way of seeing things, because when there's a hole in the web of signifiers, then things aren't going to work in quite the same way they would work for neurotic subjectivity, for example. Although, of course, the point you're making is that these are discrete psychotic episodes, which presumably you can also have in neurotic structure. But nevertheless, what I think is so important about it is a couple of things. One, it reminds me of that line that Jacques-Alain Millet often refers to, a disturbance at the innermost juncture of the subject's sense of life. And of course, the idea of a disturbance at the innermost juncture of a subject's sense of life can mean how they relate to their body, how they relate to their own ideas, how they relate to their surrounding world. So it's just a nice way of putting those two ideas together. And that disturbance at the innermost junction of a subject's sense of life presumably occurs when there is a hole in this web of signifiers.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to connect those two. But the further thing that is so important about that is that in many everyday understandings of what is happening in a hallucination is that you're seeing something that isn't objectively there. Now, there might be some, evidence, and obviously that sounds like a good way of thinking about it, but a sort of more refined way, and I think this is the Lacanian way of thinking about it, is that's not the only way to understand a hallucination. You also see it as a response to what happens when the web of signifiers is not working. So just wanted to highlight that. I mean, we could take it up further if you want. But I thought those two things were extremely important, as was the idea of a revelation. And I think here you're also referring to the idea of elementary phenomena, this, the early stages of a psychosis. So I wanted to move on a little bit, unless you had comments on that, to ask.
Well, I just wanted to add indeed that there is a link with at the basis of a hallucination, at the basis of delusions, is something of a paradoxical experience, meaning that, or you could say like an experience of real, like something is not working, something that it's not comprehensible, something really not comprehensible, or situations or events they're confronted with lie at the basis. And then you could say that if the web of signifiers fails to kind of grasp it and to kind of like cover it up, then we will indeed have like hallucinations. That's a hypothesis. And what is the hallucination then? Like, you could say, like, it's Lacan says in Seminar 3, it's an unchained signifier. So meaning that it's a signifier that is no longer fitting the web of signifiers, but nonetheless that is connected to it, albeit that then typical of psychosis is that it is experienced as completely outside, as a completely alienated element. But psychotically speaking, of course, there is something of a connection.
Yeah. I think that's very well put. That also helps us think a little bit about another theme, and this relates to work you've done in other contexts as well. But in my experience of reading, the secondary literature and introductions to Lacanian psychoanalysis, people sometimes passingly refer to the notion of mental automatism or mental automatisms. And then, there's a little bit of a line or two on de Clerambault, and then they move on. But one of the things that you've done, and I think particularly well in this book, is you talk about what are mental automatisms for de Clerambault. Now, Lacan's going to do something different with that. We don't have to worry an awful lot about the technicalities. But here's, I think, if I find the quote, how you put it, you say that de Clerambault's ideas of mental automatism are helpful as a way of thinking about prodromal symptoms of psychosis. And then you say for de Clerambault, he was focused on the way in which we think and speak, the way in which we experience our body and our effects and changes in concrete behavior. Then you also note that for de Clerambault, these disruptions, mental automatism being a form of disruption, psychical disruption, behavioral disruption, that these disruptions often take positive or negative forms. They often take the form, in other words, of intrusions or absences. I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more about that, because that seemed a very helpful way of conceptualizing some of the disturbances we see in psychosis. And I think you've already kind of linked it back to Lacan when you spoke about an unchained signifier.
Yeah.
Anyway, any thoughts on de Clerambault on intrusive or absenting factors in either thought or behavior or self-experience? What do we learn from de Clerambault that is practicable in the clinic today, you could say?
Yeah. Well, I think the strength of de Clerambault is that he has this phenomenological view on psychosis. He was not starting from phenomenology as a philosophical discipline. He was like a real biological psychiatrist in France and one of Lacan's teachers. But Lacan took him as the one who was giving like a very detailed phenomenological description of psychosis. And de Clerambault had this biological focus and thought that there were indeed like prodromal signs, like, and this is also what contemporary psychiatry is often focused on, screening, like early screening on signs of psychosis, but always starting from this illness model. And the idea then is like, if we have the early view, or if we can grasp early on the discrete symptoms of psychosis, we can try to limit these. Well, de Clerambault also had that interest, but in his case, it was like more to kind of predict, will it become a full-blown psychosis or not? And is a person accountable for actions or not? That was de Clerambault's question. But Lacan is not taking it that way and is indeed conceptualizing it. But very powerful to Clerambault's description is that he kind of makes the distinction between you can have these automatisms at the cognitive verbal level, you can have it at an affective emotional level, and you can have it at the behavioral level, where two things can occur. Or there is something of an impulse that will be added, like a thought that you were not thinking, or a feeling in you that you were not feeling, but that is overwhelming, or a tendency in your actions that you don't want to actually do, but still the impulse is there to do it. So it's that's something of the positive phenomenon. And then you have the negative, which is the experience that something can disappear, like lacking thoughts, having no words anymore, and then a perplexity around it, or like having no feeling anymore, or like having no initiative at all anymore, or being unable to do something, even move your body, like in classic psychiatry, which is the catatonic action, like a body like in a specific position and an inability to act and to do something with it. So for me, de Clerambault is very powerful, like as a phenomenological structure to organize this complexity, this descriptive complexity. And it's very good to have it next to Lacan, because Lacan adds, you could say, like the psycholytic conceptual line of reasoning about these phenomena. But if we only have the very conceptual thing, it might be dangerous as a clinician to not really see, like, okay, but what is the broadness of the phenomena that Lacan is actually referring to? Because he had it really in mind, I think, because he was trained in that psychiatric tradition, and in his earlier work he had been describing the psychiatric tradition in detail. So for me, the strength is actually in the combination, and we can clearly link it to contemporary examples. Like, for example, in the book, in the chapter on the discrete psychotic phenomena, I link it to the work and the autobiographical book of Piet Kuiper, who was a Dutch psychiatrist. He was a professor of psychiatry, also inspired by psychoanalysis. And this person, he had the first psychotic outbreak the moment he retired. So he was in his 60s. And at that very point, he has a psychotic outbreak, which for him was a paradox because he had been teaching about psychosis for the whole of his life. And then he has a psychotic outbreak himself. And he, for example, clearly describes in that autobiographical book how he, for example, had suddenly murderous intentions and impulses. Like,
Mm.
like he observed that he was a danger because if he was in the kitchen and he saw a kitchen knife lying there, um, he had the impulse of taking the knife and stabbing his daughter. That was like something of an automatic impulse that occurred in him, but he was witnessing the impulse, and therefore he decided, like, I have to go to psychiatry. I must be admitted to a hospital, which is kind of how it usually goes. That in psychosis, when these discrete phenomena occur, that it often leads to something of a perplexity and an anxiety or a bewilderment at the level of the subject who is being witness to it. And therefore, as clinicians, we have to be there not to see it as precursors of a later illness, but rather like indeed experiences of bewilderment in relation to these impulses. And it's very difficult then to already make sense of it and to be the subject of the impulse, because that's exactly what you're not. You're not Kuiper is not the subject of this impulse in him, although he observed that the impulse is in him. So it's something of a subjective destitution that happens at that point. And the very difficulty of what it entails is something that we as clinicians should be very attentive to, and to try to find with people how to respond to it, and how to deal with it. And if they don't have the words and if it's very difficult for them to do something with it, maybe in the transference, in the talking therapy that we have with them, we can look for ways to respond to it. And that should be the basic attitude. And nowadays, it's often the basic attitude in clinical settings is like, okay, but then you have to take antipsychotic medication because the antipsychotic medication will kind of dampen that experience. And, and I do agree that in some cases, it's very useful to have the antipsychotics as a tool. But I think it should be a tool, the antipsychotics, and not the automatic standard response to it. The automatic standard response to it should be like they are witnessing the strangeness in themselves. Clinicians should be there to witness together with the individuals who are having that experience. And I think that our speech and our connecting with them can be a way to try to reconnect for them in their mental lives with what is happening. And that's the most important thing, clinically speaking, that we can do at that moment.